On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Aidan Anderson. He is the security engineering manager at FloQast. I'm lucky to have him on to talk about how platform and security engineering are converging because Aidan has a unique background coming from a developer-centric view now into security engineering and obviously a manager. So super interested to get his views on this topic. Aidan, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So yeah, why don't you, I guess, give us a little context of who you are and what FloQast does, and we'll jump into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Aidan, I work at FloQast, as you mentioned. FloQast specifically, we are a fintech company. We focus on the financial close. So we are close management software by accountants for accountants, really trying to make accountants' lives easier and focusing on that space in particular. And yeah, as you mentioned, I kind of started off actually very, very early on in IT and made my way into software dev and then finally into kind of where I am now in security, managing the team at FloQast.
Awesome. What does your team look like? I guess, you're managing security engineering, but what's the team makeup? Is it all just security engineers? What does the team, do day to day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the moment, the current team kind of is focused really across the board on really all components of security, all functional components, really. We've got a few members that are very focused on application security, a few members that are focused on more cloud security, and a few that are focused on IT. And so we're just a very, flexible, cross-functional team hopping into different teams' processes or trying to push things along kind of across the board. There's also very, very much like a heavy compliance focus as well, which we play a part in. But yeah, kind of a generalist team with specialities in each area.
Gotcha. I guess from your perspective, I mean, your career, obviously started on the IT side, software development. Now you're managing the security side of things. I know we talk a lot about, shifting left, and I guess specifically, in discussion with you is kind of the convergence of how, some of that platform stuff that you see, companies are touching on the, different public cloud. And then also security pieces are now kind of tying in, sharing common tools with other engineering teams. Like, what are you seeing with that convergence?
Yeah, that's kind of a really interesting area. And I feel like, especially talking to people about security, there's just, every team's a little different. Every team's approaching it in kind of a unique way, building kind of a more of like a bespoke solution for the problems your company is kind of facing, right? And, as I was listening to other individuals on your podcast, and, I think we've definitely found with the current team we have that the team itself, needs to be very business minded, needs to really, really have the ability to jump in, understand business requirements and kind of like get to the root of problems. But yeah, specifically from the platform side and how it relates to more of my dev experience, we found a lot of value in definitely doing all the right things, of course, like making sure we're following normal compliance frameworks and making sure those things are being adhered to. That's always a baseline is always very important. But we've seen a lot of gains in really focusing on design and kind of this like concept of security by design and, security through designing your systems deliberately. So, we've kind of taken a data oriented approach, focusing on the systems that are kind of holding the core data sets, and then working very closely with specifically our platform team, which produces tools and produces, products that other software engineering teams use. And so, it's really helped us with going for kind of more of like a framework built-in approach where you're getting, secure by default tooling, and it's just immediately layered into kind of the development lifecycle and how our systems are built, which has been really good, I think.
I mean, you guys are partnering with the platform team pretty closely. I mean, I guess how long was that? How long has that been going on? Is it, since you got there? Was it there before you even started?
Yeah, so it's relatively new. I think just the normal evolution of a startup. We back in the day we were just like three developers in a garage, and now we have a pretty big team, right? And so over time you start to realize that all these other teams are having the exact same problem, and we should try to solve those particular problems. And then I think we realized too that like as a security team, you need to focus on your perimeter. And it definitely feels like you're focusing on or having to focus on just a million different things. You keep squashing problems left and right, and you never really get to solve the root problem. So, we've fairly recently been able to really engage with them. And, in reality, it's something we were kind of doing all along, really focusing on our systems, focusing on design, thinking about how the product is evolving and thinking about security kind of at the beginning. How can we design it in? But now we really have a team that's also dedicated to producing that kind of specific outcome.
I think I'm now hearing kind of consistently people talking about, starting the security, I guess, incorporating security further into the application development process, the software engineering development process sooner. There's a lot more benefits. I guess with the way you're partnering, with the platform engineering team, like when it comes time to deciding tools to use, obviously, and again, it could be different in every company, but you in particular, is there any collaboration, or are they, taking the lead on deciding, hey, these are the tools, these are the, technologies we're implementing, and security's kind of just kind of following their footstep? Or do you guys have input and saying, hey, we really need maybe, X, Y, and Z to help us as well?
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of a two-pronged approach, speaking to the whole kind of shifting left thing. It definitely kind of behooves the security team and behooves our mission to really understand where the company's going and understand what's on the roadmap so we can get ahead of bigger things, right? But specifically with the platform team, it's very much I'd say, cross-functional relationship. And it gets to the point where that platform team becomes just incredible security champions. The security team is almost like the product owner, where they're curating the problems across the organization. They're seeing the patterns, they're seeing where we're going, and they're seeing kind of the recurring risks, and keeping track of that with like a risk register or whatever. And then bringing that to the platform team and explaining what the problem is, and then really getting into the nitty gritty of engineering. But what we've seen is we've been able to not just solve one-off like vulnerabilities, but actually like mitigate the root of risk by creating creating solutions that like solve that class of problems, specifically like solve that class of vulnerability across the board. So we just don't have to, we can really reduce a issue from being something we're seeing just over and over again down to just a handful. But yeah, to answer your question directly, again, it's very much a kind of joint partnership. The platform team, they're really great champions, and they're up to speed enough with like the problem we're trying to solve. Now they're out, engaging with development teams and feeding us more information and finding like really specific bugs or specific problems. And, that iteration loop has just kind of started. So there's a feedback loop between the teams from both kind of the lower level with the developers directly, so we understand just how effective some of these controls are, paying attention to usability too. And then also from the more of like the product top level specifically.
Interesting. I guess, you guys have, and it sounds like it's kind of a pretty good process, pretty good partnership, between where the platform team touches, the software development, core. When you're looking at this, let's say somebody is not where you're at, and I'm always curious about this, and they want to start, is the platform team potentially, I mean, obviously every team, every company calls their teams and potentially groups them differently, but the people more in charge of platform engineering, would they be the right person potentially start the partnership with? Is there another ideal target for kind of building this kind of relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it really kind of comes down to there is a level of sort of buy-in that's absolutely necessary. And we initially we tried out just a variety of different strategies for application security specifically. Like the whole security champion idea has been thrown around a lot. I think what we found, to kind of answer the question there, is like initially we were trying to hire security individuals and security engineers, and actually have them be on the pod teams and be on the engineering teams, and to be on the ground, to hear what's going on, to be like a representative there in the team. But, we kind of found that wasn't necessarily a great use of time. They were spinning their wheels a lot of the time, or, if a team is just talking about building a front end, it's just not as applicable. It's kind of like you build a front end once and you put that pattern in place, and then it's kind of good to go as long as it's secure. So, that's how it kind of started initially. And then we found that we're kind of diluting our efforts here there's actually a handful of problems that really matter. Like, again, we don't necessarily care about building a front end over and over, but we care that we're doing it in the right way. Right. And so we kind of took a step back, and instead of focusing more on the features, and the security team itself started focusing more on kind of the general patterns that we were seeing and how we were developing our software. It's more of just kind of the architecture. And then, it kind of developed from there where, really me and the team had a really core involvement with our architectural team, talking about some of the patterns we're seeing, putting our minds together, discussing how development is evolving. And now that's led to a point where we're, building tools that give us a kind of a faster iteration loop. Because at that point, it was more of like definitely very retroactive, like, okay, well, we did this thing. How are we going to do it better next time? And of course, that still happens. That's just how building an engineering team and SaaS goes. But now that we have kind of like more boots on the ground, it definitely has kind of helped with that strategy, I think.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean that makes sense in terms of why potentially the platform team is ideal. I guess from your explanation, I could see why that partnership's close. When you're now looking at the working relationship, obviously, how much of it is predicated on them understanding more security, right? So obviously, you guys from the security team are understanding the platform side, sharing CI/CD tools. How much of a uplift did they have to do to get involved more into security? Because obviously, I'm just kind of gauging the relationship, right? So if you guys are moving into the platform side, shifting left, have they actually shifted to the security side a little bit more to kind of be a little more involved?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it kind of, leads to security can mean, again, just so many different things. Like a security engineer can be doing, it's just, so many different tasks on a day to day. So, it's definitely been interesting to see how their understanding of security has kind of evolved to the point, where it's at. But yeah, just having that exposure specifically has really, really increased, I think, their awareness of the types of problems that we're solving because they're so closely ingrained in just how we're doing things as a development team. They're really starting to kind of connect the dots between, okay, this is like, you know, they can see why it's kind of a risk for the company. And then they can start to point out like all the little flaws that would prevent us from really being able to kind of like solve that specifically. Yeah. So yeah, there definitely has been a kind of increase in awareness. And, I think it's been sort of, getting back to the point of diluting efforts, it's again, like incredibly important that everyone has awareness across the org, understands security. Like that's a challenge on its own. I think what I've kind of seen, especially talking to people, it really seems like, teams spend, like a breach happens, then everyone says, darn, if everyone just cared about security a little bit more, we could have prevented it, right? So let's just teach and train harder, which is kind of true and good. Yeah, again, you should empower everyone. But, are you really thinking about the root of the problem? And I think going back to the point of platform, in explaining these problems, the platform team, it really, it's a set of very creative software engineers. And so they'll think of these very increasingly interesting technical solutions for those types of problems. It's like you kind of give them a risk and they'll produce a really great solution. So yeah, there's been a great, I guess, shift, both left and kind of more right, I guess, on their team, which has helped further this really across the org and in the engineering department specifically.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, because I've been talking to enough security people on the podcast, and shifting left is on everyone's radar. Depending on how far left, every organization has different needs. But I started now looking at it, going, well, what about the other departments are if security is shifting left, other departments are shifting right, which to me just means they're getting more involved in some of the fundamentals of security beyond what their previous scope was. And I just think it's interesting that there seems to be a convergence from whether you're on the operations side and DevOps is creeping into software engineering. You have, on the security side, DevSecOps, which is creeping into DevOps, and then security engineering is kind of touching platform. It seems like everything is kind of moving towards being software engineering oriented because obviously everything is a service, everything's in the cloud. So it just seems like an interesting, shift in maybe what was 10 years ago.
I completely agree. You kind of hit the nail on the head. Everything is defined as code. Everything's in the cloud. Everything's immutable, which is great. It's really good for security. You don't have any pets lingering there just, accumulating vulnerabilities over a period of time. But, I think there's kind of an interesting point there too around in order to compete, you kind of have to think in terms of scale. And I think it's kind of forced security to do the same thing. If you're building a SaaS or starting a startup, you're not going to host an on-premise server. You're going to go to the cloud, because you can scale up and down just so incredibly quickly. And so I think, especially on the security side, it's definitely forced, I think, a new way of thinking. You can't just think about sort of these one-off servers, right? You can't think of one-off problems. Security is kind of a function of keeping track of the perimeter and keeping track of the volume of all the things. And now there's just too many things, right? So you have to think a little more creatively, and you have to think about, can we reduce these problems down to like a core set to solve them across the board? So, if you have like thousands of EC2 instances running in AWS, instead of like patching each one by one, how can we create something that helps us solve this at scale consistently and build a process around it so we don't necessarily have to come back to it? But, I think another kind of component of that you kind of touched on there is this kind of like every side shifting a little more toward each other. And I think it kind of comes back to, again, things are moving so quickly. We're trying to build a successful company. Everyone wants that. That's kind of a shared goal. Let's build a really well-functioning SaaS company, right? Because SaaS is kind of eating the world at this point. And so because of that agility, you kind of have to speak in terms of the same like business problems that the company is solving. You have to think about it from that perspective and then try to pare it down. So,
sometimes I'm listening and I'm wondering, there's some things that seem to be getting simpler and some things that are getting a lot more complex. And, if you're looking at the skill sets required, a decade ago, they were different than they are now. I don't know if that translates to more or less complex. I mean, what are your thoughts?
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, and I think that's kind of where like you said, everything's in the cloud, everything's defined as code. It's definitely more complex, I guess, is like just us being human thinking about the problem, right? It's like you can't just point your finger at any one specific thing. Yeah, you have to think a little more deeply, I think.
Definitely interesting challenges ahead. But I mean, I like what you guys are doing. It sounds really exciting because it sounds like there's a good baseline, a good harmony. I appreciate you coming on to kind of chat about this. I know your background's kind of unique, starting off as a software developer. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and maybe a little more on that point. I was catching up with my kind of train of
Sure.
thought there specifically. Yeah, I think just as a software engineer, when you're approaching problems, you're thinking about, not just solving it in kind of a one-off case. Again, you're thinking about building a feature that a bunch of people are going to use. And so, I think that's kind of forced security to think of things in the exact same way because we're building for scale and we're building for rapid adoption and building for producing features and functionality that just like thousands of people can use. You have to think of things in the exact same way. You have to think of things at that scale. So yeah, I think you're totally right. It's kind of forcing everyone involved to think more kind of like from a software perspective to, think about kind of things from the standpoint of automation specifically.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah, I think that's a good note and appreciate you sharing. And I was excited to have you on because I know, you have a different background and I think you definitely did a great job of articulating that. If somebody does have a question, they want to follow up on anything you mentioned, what's a good way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm more than happy to kind of share my email, which I can give to you, or LinkedIn is always an option too. So yeah, feel free to just shoot me a message, and happy to chat more. So
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll put your LinkedIn in the show notes. Definitely appreciate you being on and thank you for your time. And that's it for this episode of the podcast. We'll be back again. I always ask for two things from y'all. One is, pleased with the topics. It's been helpful. I'm getting topics every week. We're just trying to find the right guests to match up with those topics. And hopefully we're bringing you value in producing those type of shows. And secondly, subscribe to the podcast and more importantly, leave a review because unfortunately, all these algorithms and all the podcasts your podcast bubbles up with more reviews and more feedback, because obviously that's how the system works. So we've been seeing some spikes in our listenership, and I can't thank you guys enough. But yeah, leave a review. That'd be the next thing I could ask you all to do for us, and that'd be fantastic. Until next time, thanks.